Greetings and welcome to Florida Pirate Radio. Today, I hope to answer the question, what's not to like about Dr. Henry Abramson? Dr. Abramson is a Jewish historian with a whole pile of videos available on YouTube concerning, well, Jewish history, including his Jewish History Lab, which is, I think, up over 90, maybe even 95 videos right now, accumulating all the time. And anyway, if you're just here to get the answer to that question, what's not to like about Dr. Abramson and his Jewish History Lab, the answer is this: probably nothing, but who knows? If you want to know how I got to that conclusion, then I would like to spend some time answering some other questions that are connected with that analysis. One of them is Jewish history after Jesus important to Christians? Secondarily, who were the Jews anyway? And thirdly, how is Dr. Abramson's work of assistance? I'll answer these questions right up front for you in order. Yes, that history is important. Secondarily, the Jews are a people in respect of whom it should always be asked who they are, but that question should never be answered. And thirdly, how is Dr. Abramson's analysis helpful? Well, three things. He is fearless, he is fair, and he is funny. He is fearless in that there is no topic in Jewish history that he will not address and look at and discuss. He is fair in that he's careful, he sources everything, as far as I can see, and if there is a dispute in the record, he calls attention to it. And funny, he tells good jokes. So I need to start off by telling you a little bit about where I'm coming from, and just very quickly, I was raised as an Episcopalian in eastern Pennsylvania. I was educated in eastern United States, ultimately did a law degree in Toronto, Canada, and I've lived there ever since, on vacation in Florida just now. And I, to characterize my outlook, I think you'd call it fairly traditional, fairly old school, more Anglican than Episcopalian. I like the idea that when I talk to a Catholic, I seem Protestant. When I talk to a Protestant, I seem Catholic. And that's sort of squarely the Anglican Episcopalian tradition, and so that's really where I come from. But when I was in Sunday school, I was taught, as one might expect, all about the Bible, and we were given the Old Testament and the New Testament, and like anybody else, spent time learning about it. And it was put to me that the New Testament somehow canceled out the Old Testament. And this was said in all seriousness. And I remember at a young age thinking, how can the narratives of the Old Testament, on the one hand, form the basis, the narrative basis and mythological basis of all of Western civilization, yet it was all for naught. With the making of the New Covenant in Christianity, it was done. It was over. The law as St. Paul said, was obsolete. Now, I didn't know it at the time, but I was being taught supersessionism. And supersessionism is it's a fairly recent term. The church has never really used it, but the church has pretty well always subscribed to it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of that, drawing on some of Dr. Abramson's comments and some of my own research. But supersessionism has different parts. Its principal part is that the Christian revelation replaced the necessity for the existence of the Jewish perspective, that it took over. It's also secessionism is also known as replacement theory, because it's a theory of the replacement of one religion by another. The other part of supersessionism or replacement theory is the notion that the universal Christian church has superseded or replaced the ancient people of Israel as the contracting parties to God's covenant. And this lasted for a very long time, up until very recently, until really the defining moment seems to have been, weirdly, the Holocaust. Because, as I will explain shortly, the bottom dropped out of supersessionism after World War II. But first I want to spend a few minutes and look at when and how this idea got started. One needs to look to the 3rd century to find clear statements of an exclusive claim to the saving hand of God. I would look to Saint Cyprian of Carthage, mid-3rd century, who said, salus, in Latin, salus extra ecclesiam non est. There is no salvation outside of the church. And with the movement of Christianity into the middle and then ultimately upper echelons of Roman society, this sense of ownership of salvation, the ownership of what had been in the Roman Empire a sense of the leader of the land being someone who consorts with the gods to the benefit of all. And it was as Christianity moved in that direction that this supersessionist idea began to take root. The posture of supersessionism continued through the progress of the development of Christianity, reaching perhaps its high watermark or low watermark, depending on your view, in a declaration made by Pope Boniface VIII in 1302. He had been involved in an unseemly debate over taxation with King Philip of France, and in the course of that he issued a papal bull stating as follows: "Furthermore, we declare, we proclaim, we define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman Pontiff." And I ask you, what's on your mind? You get out of bed in the morning and you feel like saying something useful. What kind of a mood are you in when you say something like that? I now jump forward some 500 years to a new type of supersessionism that came on the scene with the writing of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, a early 19th century German philosopher who elevated the study of history, the idea of history, to a level of philosophy itself, and in it he postulated the idea of a succession of revelatory and developmental moments in history that essentially describe the ascent of man, the ascent of humanity over time. He described the Jewish contribution as having been universalized by Christianity, saying, "The temple of Zion is destroyed. The God-serving nation is scattered to the winds." And it's been argued that this represented a call to arms by Jewish intellectuals to participate in the writing of history. So this is something that Jews had not really done much over the years. They were obviously busy with other things. But, and we have the Jewish historian Josephus and so on, but after that, there is really no Jewish Eusebius. There is no Jewish Edward Gibbon. But we do find in the 19th century a proliferation of Jewish historians who, again, it's been argued, felt the need to participate in the writing of philosophical history. Now, astonishingly, after World War II, and following some 1,800 years of supersessionist theology, the whole idea collapsed. It's hard to say why. Was it because people felt sorry for the Jews because of the Holocaust? Was it because the world became witness to a biblical style restoration of the Jews to their homeland, to Eretz Israel? Who can say? But it is most definitely the case that certainly institutional Christianity decided to chuck the whole idea. And we find, for instance, at the time of Vatican II, Pope Paul VI issued a declaration, Nostra Aetate, Our Times, saying, "God holds the Jews most dear for the sake of their fathers. He does not repent of the gifts he makes or of the calls he issues." Well, isn't that special? After all that time, to come around to a statement of that kind. Similarly, in 2013, in something called an apostolic exhortation, Pope Francis I stated, "We hold the Jewish people in special regard because their covenant with God has never been revoked." Now, talk is cheap, but these are astonishing statements to come down the pipe from institutional Christianity. Now, I'd like to take a moment to introduce my next topic. by discussing the Christian idea of salvation. We talk about the Near Eastern salvation religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And in the Christian New Testament, we find in the Gospels that the word salvation is only used by Jesus twice, only twice. The Greek word for salvation is soteria, and we find in one story in the Gospel of Luke a moment where Jesus is proposing to stay at the home of an individual named Zacharias. And Zacharias was not a good person. He was a tax collector and was not thought well of. And of course, Jesus' followers are saying, "What are you hanging out with that guy for? He's look at who he is and what he does." And Jesus said, "Today, salvation has come to this house because he also is a son of Abraham." So this is a view of salvation which springs directly from Jesus' relationship with a fellow Jew. How salvation comes from that, I leave to the theologians. However, the context is important. Similarly, in the only other use of the Greek word soteria, and of course the New Testament is written entirely in Greek, the only other usage of the word soteria by Jesus is found in the Gospel of John, in which he says to a Gentile, a Samaritan, "You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews." Now I'd like to take a moment and look at the Greek text of this last statement. And you'll see that it reads, "He soteria ek ton eudaion estin." Salvation is from the Jews, using the Greek preposition ek. And you will see in some translations, particularly the King James Version, that ek gets translated as of. That is to say, salvation is of the Jews, which is a watered down version of the original. The original says from, and the preposition ek has a meaning of out of, in the sense of from the inside to the outside of, or even temporally since or from in terms of time, or even because of. There's just as an example, there was an expression in ancient Greece, which has survived into modern English idiom, from the bottom of the heart, ek, bathus cardias, from, like just welling up from. Now, in the early church, there was, of course, a great deal of discussion and concern about how much of Judaism was going to be kept by those who were now following Jesus. And it wasn't settled for a very long time. Professor Abramson has anatomized this part of history far better than I could. I would like, however, just as an introduction to some things that I want to say about the 4th century, to call attention to a word that only appears once in the entire Bible, but which comes up again and again and again, moving forward even to the present day. And it is the word Judaize. And I'm referring here to St. Paul's letter to the Galatians, in which he writes, "But when I saw that they walked not uprightly according to the truth of the gospel, I said unto Peter before them all, If thou, being a Jew, livest after the manner of Gentiles, and not as do the Jews, why compellest thou the Gentiles to live as do the Jews?" Now this, of course, is in the context of a dispute that arose between Paul and Peter as to whether and to what extent the Jewish law, I'll call it, should bind the Gentiles. Should they undergo circumcision? Should they observe kashrut, the dietary laws? And these were big considerations. I would, however, like to focus on St. Paul's use of this verb, Judaize. The Greek word is eudaizein. Now that can be translated, as I showed you in the text of Galatians, it can be translated as to live as do the Jews, or it can perhaps more accurately be translated as to side with or imitate the Judeans. This is something that is a word that was at least 200 years old in the Greek language. The Jews certainly knew a lot about Hellenic and Hellenistic Greece, but Hellenistic Greece knew a lot about the Jews. This is a word that I think the earliest use of the word is found in the 2nd book of Maccabees, which is a text that only ever existed in Greek. First Maccabees existed in Hebrew, was translated into Greek. The Hebrew version was lost. The 2nd Maccabees only ever existed in Greek, and we find that this word is used there, and the context is really in terms of the ethnicity of the Judeans, of the people who lived in Judea, who were the Jews, of course, but it was sort of an ethnic reference. The Saint Jerome, when he composed the Vulgate, being the translation of the Bible from Hebrew and Greek into Latin, for the first time comprehensively into Latin, he seems to have just simply transliterated the Greek verb, and we have I think for the first time, the Latin verb eudaizare, which was unknown in ancient Roman usage before Jerome brought this into the Vulgate in the 4th century. I've not been able to find any earlier use of this sort of made-up Latin verb. But the question, as I say, concerning the Judaizing of the early Christian church is something that wasn't settled for quite some time. We find in the 2nd century some two extreme examples concerning the sects of the Marcionites and the Ebionites. Now, the Marcionites were very, very anti-Judaizing. One might call it a proto-anti-Semitism, but I don't know that that's completely the case with the Marcionites. They were more thinking that, look, we're new, we're different, we're separate from the Jews and from Judaism, and now they went to a very weird extreme and decided they would only look at religious texts written by Gentiles, which reduced their store of scriptures down to almost nothing. Luke and the book of Acts and a handful of epistles, and so they really just stripped out everything that they could see that was Jewish in order to be Christians as they thought they should be, as completely separate from the Jews. Now, at the other end of the scale, you have the Ebionites. Now, the Ebionites are referred to by St. Paul, that is to say, the poor of Jerusalem. And the Ebionites were fully Jewish. They rejected the oral law, as did the Sadducees for some reason, but they were really fully and completely Jewish Christians. But I can say this about both the Marcionites and the Ebionites, is that they both utterly failed. They did not survive past the 2nd century and are now lost as an organized way of following Christ. Now, the question for Christians as to whether and to what extent they should Judaize extended into the 4th century, and in the course of that pivotal time, the issue was resolved. But it took a lot of time to reach that resolution. And it's important to look at the demographics of the Roman Empire at that time. Take the year 300. At about that time, the Christians represented no more than about 10% of the Roman Empire, and they had not reached into any part of Roman society that held power. The country of Armenia in 301 became the first country to become officially Christian, but they were out of the mainstream, and the Roman Empire itself was not well disposed towards Christians at all. There had been a number of very serious persecutions, particularly including the Decian persecution, and it was an outlawed religion. It was the religion of knaves and slaves. It was a religion that was thought to be contrary to the interests of Roman society. We see in the writing of Tacitus, the Roman historian, his view that Christians had what he called the odium generis humanae, a hatred of the human race. They were people given to terrible superstitions. They were thought to engage in incest. They were thought to engage in cannibalism. They were thought to engage in sorcery. And reputationally, in the empire at large, they were not well thought of at all. But there was a two-stroke public relations miracle that took place in the early 4th century, which had the effect ultimately of Christianizing the entire empire. The first of these two strokes was the Diocletian persecution, Under Emperor Diocletian, Christians suffered their worst persecutions really of all time. This is debated by some historians, starting, I think, with Edward Gibbon in the 18th century. However, the record is quite clear that these persecutions were not only extensive but very public, and it wasn't just feeding Christians to the lions in the arena. It was death squads coming into town demanding that people hand over their scriptures, and horrible public executions and floggings and dismemberments, and it was a terrible time. Now, it's worth noting that at this time the Jewish population of the Roman Empire approximated that of the Christians. The Jews suffered a terrible setback in the early 2nd century with the Bar Kokhba rebellion, which at least one historian says destroyed, in terms of a percentage of world Jewry, more than the Holocaust. I don't know, but it was certainly an extreme setback for the Jewish people, and an unmitigated slaughter. But nevertheless, their numbers by the beginning of the 4th century were back up and were, as I say, approximating that of the Christians. Now, the Jews were very differently situated. They were in communication with people of power, and they were not in any way in competition with the Christians. Their relationship with the Roman Empire, which was obviously a fraught one, nevertheless was based on some very deep historic understandings. Particularly, the Romans had enormous respect for they had enormous respect for anything that was ancient, and of course the Jews were manifestly, singularly ancient as a people. The Romans also deeply respected the Jews because of their apparent ability to stand up to the Seleucid Greeks. In the 2nd century BC, at the time of the Maccabees, the Romans subjugated the Seleucid Greeks, and after that process were astonished that the Jews had been able to stand up to the Seleucids. Anyway, time went on, and we come to the introduction of Constantine. Constantine was with his father in northern England, battling the Scots, when his father died, and he was proclaimed emperor. Now, there were a number of emperors of the empire at that time. It was a complicated arrangement. But Constantine had a mother named Helena, and Helena was a Christian. And Helena wanted her son to be Christian, and it's a big historical question how Christian or not Constantine was. But it is known that he marched on Rome, encountered a rival emperor, Maxentius, at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312. Now, this battle was notable in that it represented the first time that a Christian won a battle with God on his side. And it's been debated whether or not the story was true or made up afterwards, that before the battle Constantine saw a sign in the sky, in hoc signo vinces, in this sign you will conquer. and emblazoned the Greek letters Chi and Rho on his and his soldiers' swords, following which they defeated Maxentius, who fell off the bridge and drowned. Now, whether or not that happened is beside the point. It is nevertheless a moment in Judaizing, if you will, because up until this point in history, there had been no Christian armies, there had been no Christian attacks or soldiers or anything like that. The Christians were famous for being stupidly passive, didn't seem to really care what happened to them, didn't seem to care when they were being slaughtered in the persecutions, and in fact, that it was that passive quality is what made the church grow. The Christian writer Tertullian made the comment that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and indeed it was. As I said, but that was just the first stroke of this public relations coup. Because the second stroke was, look, maybe Christians aren't going to be that passive after all. And so we have Constantine becoming emperor. He wins this battle, he becomes emperor, and he promulgates what is famously known as the Edict of Milan in the year 312. Now, the Edict of Milan was neither an edict nor was it made in Milan, but it made a promise on the part of this new emperor of religious toleration. But implicitly in the fact of a Christian being emperor is a Judaizing quality, in that the history of the Jews had been one where success in battle was an expression of God's assistance to them. And so now we have success in battle leading to the emperor himself being Christian. Now, the Edict of Milan contained in it the following language, and I want you to pay particular attention to the tone that is being used here. When we, Constantine Augustus and Licinius Augustus, met so happily at Milan, and considered together all that concerned the interest and security of the state, we decided to grant to Christians and to everybody the free power to follow the religion of their choice, in order that all that is divine in the heavens may be favorable and propitious towards all who are placed under our authority. Now, it's commonly thought that Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. He did not, obviously. In this document, he says, look, you have what religion you might like. And indeed, I mean, how is he going to make everybody Christian? I mean, as I say, it was only about 10% of the empire was Christian, about 10% Jewish, and the rest big pagan hodgepodge. So when he says this, he's really setting himself up as a kind of a model, as an exemplar of belief. The rest of the empire didn't really pay that much attention to it. I mean, so the emperor's got a new god. What else is new? The emperor, could have had all kinds of gods at any time, and they came and they went, and nobody much cared. However, we see that Christianity had penetrated to the very core of world power, and what happened afterwards was a continuing playing out of this issue of Judaizing. To what extent are we going to live and act as Jews? Now, while the Edict of Milan was full of sweetness and light and an invitation to everyone to be happy and secure, a dispute arose not long thereafter concerning the Donatists. And this is very important because the Donatists were of the view, it was a Christian sect in North Africa, they were of the view that people who had betrayed Christianity during the Diocletian persecution should not be treated favorably, that priests who had either capitulated and denounced their Christianity or who had handed over scriptures to be destroyed, that these people should be excluded from the church. And we get the word traitor from this time. It comes from the Latin traditores, that is to say, one who hands over things. These are people who handed over scriptures to be destroyed. And we get the word treason as well. We also get the word tradition, referring to the handing over of knowledge from one generation to the next. But at this time, the traditores were viewed very negatively by the Donatists, and to resolve this dispute, an appeal was made to Rome. Well, this is what happens. If you're going to be a Christian emperor, Christians are going to start asking you questions. And this is what happened. There had never been a hierarchical Christianity. There had been communities which were presided over by bishops and priests and deacons, but there had never been any kind of a comprehensive or orderly or hierarchical Christian institution. Now we have Donatists asking Constantine, well, what do we do about this? Well, Constantine, as I say, he's all full of sweetness and light, and so he says, well, look, the Donatists need to lighten up and be a little more forgiving, and that's how that was resolved. But the important thing is that Constantine recognized that it was in the interests of the state for there to be a consensus on what Christians believed. So he convened in 325 the Council of Nicaea, and this was an extraordinary event. It was attended by a who's who of early Christians. The Christian historian Eusebius was there. Constantine himself attended. He didn't so much preside. He was kind of off to the side. He wasn't a theologian. He didn't know how these things ought to go. And this was really a council to seek advice on the harmonizing of the Christian faith. Athanasius was there. St. Nicholas, later become famous as Santa Claus, jolly old St. Nick, he was there. Now, the big thing that the Council of Nicaea addressed was something called Arianism. And Arianism is, or the Arian controversy, is something that really can only ever make sense to Christians, because it had to do with the question of just what is the Trinity? How does the Trinity work? And the Arians were of the view that Christ was divine. A lot of people say, oh, the Arians denied the divinity of Christ. Not so. They did not. What they said was that Christ was divine, but he was not a deity. And in support of this, they said there was a time when Christ was not. Well, the entire premise of Christianity is that Jesus was born into time, and so it's a plausible statement to say that there was a time when he was not. But the Trinitarians did not like that, because that conflicted with their view that Christ was begotten before all worlds, coextant, consubstantial was the term, with the Father. And they really, really, really wanted to stamp out this Arianism. Arianism to them was just anathema. And this was the big discussion at Nicaea. Indeed, St. Nicholas at one point got so mad at one of the Arian bishops, he walked across the floor and punched him in the face. Can you imagine, you're an Arian bishop and you come home and you say, honey, I'm home. How was the council, dear? Oh, not so great. I got beaten up by Santa Claus. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the end of Judaizing in the 4th century. After Constantine, we have a series of emperors, some of whom were, in fact, Arian. Constantine himself was baptized only shortly before his death, and by an Arian bishop, which is a bit hard to understand given the result of the Council of Nicaea. But as we move forward, and I'm skipping over a lot of history, it's important to look at a very, very concentrated sequence of events that took place after the accession of the Emperor Theodosius. Now, Theodosius became emperor in 379, and he was a militant Trinitarian. He, in what became known, there was no such thing as either Catholic or Orthodox or all this sort of thing in those days, but he was a militant anti-Arian. He was also inclined to enforce the principles of anti-Arianism. He also decided to, for the first time, make Christianity the religion, the official religion of the Roman Empire, and to make anti-Arian Christianity the official version of Christianity. And he did this in the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 AD. And we've already looked at the Edict of Milan and its tone of sweetness and light, just a big group hug, and I hope you all enjoy your religions, whatever that may be. We now have the Edict of Thessalonica. I'll read you just one line, or one sentence from it, which has to do with how in future the Arians are going to be treated. They will suffer, in the first place, the chastisement of the divine condemnation, and in the second, the punishment of our authority, which in accordance with the will of heaven we shall decide to inflict. Well, this is a big change, isn't it, from what we saw in the Edict of Milan. This is tough talk coming from the top. This is your emperor speaking, and implicit in it is the idea that if you disagree with this, you should be fearful. Theodosius wanted to stamp out paganism, and he was in a position to do so. At this point, the demographics had changed. The two-stroke publicity coup that I have described was very effective. And by the time we get to 380 and 381 AD, the empire had become mostly Christian. And in 381, Theodosius convened the Council of Constantinople, at which time the assembled bishops condemned again Arianism and finished the creed. Now the Nicene Creed, which had been approved at Nicaea in 325, was not yet finished, and it was completed at Constantinople and rendered into a form which has been used almost unchanged ever since by Catholic and Orthodox Christians. Now, after the Council of Constantinople, an extraordinary event took place in 385, and this was the execution of Priscillian, Bishop of Avila. And it represented the first time that a Christian had killed another Christian because of their faith. But this is the sort of thing that happens when an empire, a vehicle of power, purports to become Christian. Christianity had been, as I say, a very passive religion, and now suddenly the state is executing people because of their belief. Well, what a thing is that? But it is to be now. The reaction to this event was extreme. Saint Ambrose, whom I'll discuss more in a moment, was horrified that the state should execute someone because of their belief. But nevertheless, it took place, and it was trumped up charges, and it only happened because somebody stood to benefit from the death of Priscillian. Doesn't matter. The point is, Christianity was getting tough. And things start happening fast around this period of time. The very next year is the year of the conversion of St. Augustine in 386. Augustine was essentially on scholarship to Milan from northern Africa, where he grew up. And he was a brilliant rhetorician. He was very learned, very knowledgeable, but also very adept, very articulate. And he was studying in Milan. He had occasion to listen to the preaching of St. Ambrose. Now, St. Ambrose is a man of his time, certainly, because he had been the governor of Milan. Well, how can that be? The Roman governor of Milan. Now, he happened to be a Christian, and it had become fashionable. The emperors had, with the brief exception of Julian the Apostate, the emperors had all been Christian now for quite some time. And but again, he was the governor of Milan. This is a very, very serious senior position within the Roman Empire. The city of Milan was where the emperors hung out. They didn't really want to hang out in Rome. It was too busy and smelly and noisy. And Ambrose was approached and asked if he would, by acclamation, become the Bishop of Milan, and he thought that was a pretty extraordinary proposition. But 8 days later, he was ordained priest and then consecrated bishop, and was said to have been an extraordinarily gifted preacher. Now, Augustine heard him speak and converted to Christianity, and that's a whole big long story. It's important to know about Augustine, however, that he became the singly most influential Christian of all time who was not Jewish. Obviously, Jesus, as a Jew, very influential. St. Paul, as a Jew, very influential. Augustine was an extraordinarily well-respected thinker, writer. He was prolific. He wrote, in terms of volume, he wrote more than had ever been written by any single individual up to that time in human history. He was considered very early on one of the 4 doctors of the church, which in the Western Christian tradition is the highest possible standing of theological authority. And he later became a focus point at the time of the Reformation, where, ironically, those individuals who were breaking with the traditional Western Roman Catholic Church did so at the same time doubling down on Augustine. They felt that the Roman Church had lost its way and had forgotten about what Augustine was trying to teach them. So that Augustine is a person of incalculable influence. And my suggestion is that Augustine wrote a theology for power. He wrote a theology for empire. Now, what did he say? His primary contention derived from his reading of Genesis, and what he concluded was the fall of man. He came up with the phrase original sin. He concluded that sin came into the world through Adam, and that by virtue of sexual union, sin was transmitted like a sexually transmitted disease to all of Adam's descendants. He said that humans had free will, but free will was impaired by an uncontrollable inclination to sin common to all humans. He described humanity as being a lump of sin. But he had good news. And what he had to say was that humans were rescued by divine grace, and that with divine grace they could overcome their sinful state. But divine grace is something that came from God as an irresistible force from God, and that God chose upon whom to grant grace, and in making that choice, predestined humans to their role as Christians. This idea of predestination, of course, popped up again in a big way at the time of the Protestant Reformation. But the big point to be made for Augustine's own time is that the grace of God was mediated exclusively by the Christian Church, now the established Roman Church, through the sacraments. And the Roman Church was the administrator of the sacraments. This had the effect of turning Christianity into a power structure, a sort of protection racket, where your safety was guaranteed by your oppressor. Now, all this was very new. The doctrine of original sin was something that had never been and never has been found in Judaism. Indeed, the Eastern Christian Church never really picked up on it. But the important thing is that this was part of a substantial trend of anti-Judaizing. It was at about the same time that John Chrysostom, a bishop in Antioch, engaged in a program of anti-Judaizing. That is to say, a de-Judaizing, if you will, of the Christian church. And his difficulty was that his Christian congregations were inclined to spend a lot of time in Jewish synagogues and participate in Jewish festivals and to sing Jewish songs and to do all these Jewish things. And this was a big problem for the church because it really hadn't come to terms with how far away from Judaism they could really go. The Jews, on their side, and this is well described by Dr. Abramson, had decided in about 100 A.D., as Dr. Abramson said, enough already. This is Christianity is something that is just plain not good for the Jews. Reminded of the old joke about the Jewish child who excitedly comes to see his Zadie, his grandfather, and is telling him about Babe Ruth's 60th home run. And his grandfather says, "No, but is it good for the Jews?" And indeed, the Jews had discovered that Christianity was very bad for the Jews because communities that became Christian we're wandering off the reservation. We're assimilating. We're no longer recognizably Jewish. So, and this, of course, was a big move for um, uh, the rabbis to reject Christianity, because Judaism has always been ideologically a very big tent. Um, Jews like to debate things and will debate anything with anyone at any time. But this, after a couple of generations, had proven to be so inimical to Judaism that, and Dr. Abramson describes this, the introduction of the 19th blessing. That is to say, a prayer that would be said in synagogue that no Christian could ever recite. The idea to essentially push back against the Christian tide. Christianity, on the other hand, wasn't sure how far away from Judaism. I mean, it was fundamentally Jewish religion in terms of its values, background, the entire edifice of the narratives of the Tanakh. And I use the term Tanakh as a preferred term to Old Testament. The Yale English professor Harold Bloom talked about the Hebrew Bible as being a captive book. And if we are to be sincere about abandoning our supersessionism, I believe that a greater degree of respect should be shown for the integrity of what we have now for centuries been calling the Old Testament. Anyway, John Chrysostom issued a series of anti-Judaizing homilies at this time, and this was part of a very compacted period of anti-Judaizing. We see in shortly after this period of time in 388, where St. Ambrose, I've referred to previously, warned the Emperor Theodosius about rebuilding a synagogue at a place called Callinicum on the Euphrates, on the outskirts of the Roman Empire. Theodosius, who was less de-Judaized than some, he felt bad. He had heard about the destruction of a synagogue and by Christians, and he said, as tough a guy as he was, he thought, no, this is not just, it's not fair, and he wanted to sponsor the rebuilding of this synagogue. Ambrose says, no, don't do that, because you will have people saying the emperor has become a Jew. That's a very bad thing in the eyes of St. Ambrose. The anti-Judaizing trend continued with the introduction in 390 of a fellow named Pelagius. Pelagius was from Britain. He was a Celtic monk. It's unclear how he was a monk. Monasticism was just getting invented at this period of time. St. Anthony being the first exemplar of that kind of ascetic lifestyle. But Pelagius was thought to be a monk. He shows up in Rome from Britain. He's the first English writer, by the way. He's the first person from Britain whose writings we have. And he shows up in Rome, and he is appalled at what he saw. He saw a Christianity that was unrecognizable to him. He saw wealthy people claiming to be Christian, which is unheard of to his mind. He saw powerful people claiming to be Christian, which again was contrary to every concept he had. And he ran into Augustine and Augustine's teachings. And this began a debate, a fight, if you will, between Pelagius and Augustine that lasted for decades. Pelagius was having none of this original sin, this impairment of the will, this inability. And Pelagius was of the view that no, you stand on your own 2 feet before the throne of the Almighty and declare yourself. He was of the view that, yeah, sure, divine grace is fine, but you know what? There's enough divine grace in the Scripture to empower anyone to do what they needed to do. Augustine said, no, if you carry on like that, you're negating the entire message of atonement. Of what value is Christ's sacrifice if, by your own free will, you could live a life that by itself achieves salvation? Pelagius was having none of that. He was much closer to the Jewish idea that one lives one's life with the expectation that there's a reckoning, with the expectation that what you do and how you do it matters, that the exercise of your own free will matters, and that ultimately there's a punishment and reward system, that how you live your life really impacts on how it is you're going to make out in terms of your reckoning with the Almighty. And anyway, this debate went on and on and on. And at the end of it all, Augustine won. Now, Augustine won this fight by making up a lot of things about Pelagius, which is, and I don't want to get into that embroilment, but the simple fact is that Pelagius was thought by Augustine to be a terrible heretic. In fact, worse than a heretic. He was said to be a heresiarch, that is to say, a leader of heretics. Augustine came down on him very, very hard. And ultimately, poor old Pelagius, accused of Judaizing, endlessly accused of Judaizing by Augustine, ends up being tried as a heretic. Now, 3 times Pelagius was tried as a heretic, and 3 times he beat the rap. And we don't have records of these trials, unfortunately, or not much. But this can only be because Pelagius he was a very smart guy. Even Augustine said that Pelagius was a person of enormous piety and enormous learning. And Pelagius was able to say that no, he was not saying anything that wasn't already being said, that had not already been communicated by all sorts of saintly people. Finally, Augustine managed to have Pelagius's works declared heretical. But as I say, Pelagius personally beat the rap. He disappeared ultimately. Nobody knows where he went, and it's thought that perhaps something untoward happened to him. It is really impossible to overstate the effect of Augustine's writings on the development of Western culture. He defeated Pelagius most thoroughly, to the point of Pelagius having an enduring reputation right up to the present day of being the absolute epitome and embodiment of the worst of all the heretics. But it came at great cost. To quote I'll call him a Talmudic humanist, Erich Fromm, 20th century Jewish writer, the battle was won by Augustine, and this victory was to determine and to darken man's mind for centuries. Now, Dr. Abramson describes Augustine as being his favorite church father. So, curious he should have one. But Augustine, for all of his anti-Judaizing, knew when to stop. And he developed a thing called the doctrine of witness. Specifically, he said, the Jews are thus by their scriptures a testimony to us that we have not forged the prophecies about Christ, which is an ambivalent statement, and there is much in Augustine's writings which suggest an unsympathetic attitude towards Jewish culture and traditions. Nevertheless, he created an ideological compartment for the Jews to continue to exist, which, when you're putting together a religious philosophy to be enforced by someone with the power of the Roman emperor, it became a very important thing for the Jews subsequently. Indeed, to quote James Carroll, who was call him a critic of the modern Roman Catholic Church, he said, "It is not too much to say that at this juncture Christianity permitted Judaism to endure because of Augustine." It is, of course, deeply ironic that at this point in time, when Christianity was transitioning from the power of persuasion to the power of the Roman state, that within a very short period of time, in 410, Rome was sacked and burned by an Arian barbarian named Alaric, and by 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire completely and finally collapsed. But it was not without, first, as I say, Augustine establishing a superstructure of theological power that would come to dominate Christianity for the next 1,500 years. I'll be exploring this and other topics in my next video.